Thank you so much for joining us. We know that you had so many options, so we're really glad that you're here to be a part of this conversation with us today. We're going to spend the time in this session to talk about open data. First, the challenges of implementing a sustainable open data program, but what we really want to focus on in this particular session is data quality. So how do we make sure that we're constantly releasing data that's high quality, that contains the information that residents need, and that are actually valuable as well? I have a wonderful group of panelists. Typically, I do not read people's bios word for word, but this group is impressive enough that I will. With us, we have Vijay Samata, who is the CIO of San Jose, which is the 10th largest city in the state of South Carolina. Not South Carolina, actually. I'm from South Carolina, so every time I see a C... The 10th, I don't even think there's a city as large as San Jose in South Carolina, actually. In California, he has over 20 years of experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sector. He's responsible for shaping the strategic direction for the capital of Silicon Valley, leading an IT department of over 90 employees and overseeing operations for a $2.8 billion enterprise. I think we're really excited about Vijay's contributions to this particular panel is because San Jose is in the process of relaunching its open data program. So he's going to have an opportunity to speak frankly with us about some of the challenges they face and how they've overcome those challenges. Also joining us is Andrew Nicklin, one of my lovely colleagues from the Center for... from the...
Someone's in trouble.
At least it's not me.
Some beauty done with cupcakes, I guess.
Yeah, I didn't know there were cupcakes. He's the Open Data Director at the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University. He has been called an innovative thinker and skilled technologist. He led former mayors Bloomberg's NYC Open Data program, as well as Andrew Cuomo's Open NYC program. He has worked in government for over 20 years, leading small teams, medium-sized departments, and executive governance groups. He has broad technology experience covering such areas as data operations, application lifecycle management, project management, resource planning, procurement, and more. And we're really happy to have him at Johns Hopkins. And last but not least is Dustin. He is from eRepublik. He's currently the Chief Innovation Officer for eRepublik. As the Finance Director and later CIO of Manor, Texas, a small town outside of Austin, Dustin quickly built a track record and a reputation as an early innovator in civic tech. He was a member of Code for America's original steering committee. He pioneered government use of commercial technologies such as QR barcodes, crowdsourcing, and gamification. In 2010, he launched Manor Labs, a website that let residents submit their own ideas and vote other people's ideas up and down. So I really would encourage you, even though we sort of have this artificial separation where we're at the table and you are in the audience, to ask questions and engage with us. I'm really excited about this conversation. So I just want to start out by asking just a really basic question. What are some of the common challenges that a lot of cities face when creating sustainable open data programs?
Sure. So I'll talk from the local government perspective. I think the biggest challenge is where to start. So, many people, they love open data. There's a movement behind it, which is great and really encouraging. A lot of the local government agencies just don't know where to start. And they may not have the technical expertise to unlock their data within legacy systems. There's still some cities out there that use COBOL and actually have COBOL programmers on staff. So we have a lot of challenges. We have a lot of challenges that exist when it comes to that. I think it's also making it mission critical. So, data a lot of times is put out for public consumption, which is great. There's a whole transparency movement that's happening, but I think part of it is eating your own dog food. And so one of the biggest challenges is getting government to also ingest the data that they're putting online in repositories. And so I think there's still a lot of evolution that we're kind of in the midst of right now. I'm really excited to learn more about what y'all are doing in San Jose with the relaunch, but I think that there's just a lot of challenges with how to unlock the true potential that exists within open data and take it to the next level.
I would actually completely agree with that. I mean, I think you're reading my notes here when you're saying that.
Can you make it a little bit bigger?
Not bigger, but I can make it brighter. Yes, there are some technical hurdles with getting data out, but I think the two bigger challenges are really around sustainability. So, how do you embed it into a institutional organization in such a way that it can be, continued past whoever is just interested in at that point in time, right? And that means sort of really dealing with cultural change. And then, you alluded to just on the community engagement on the consumption side of it, number one, government consuming its own data, but number two, making sure that there's an actual public community of interest, that there are people who are really leveraging that data. And if you kind of if you have that demand for it, then if things start to wane on the supply side, then, it doesn't become more expensive. People just yell a lot louder. So I think there's really keeping it sustainable is I think, one of the biggest challenges.
It's always good to go third and have everyone say everything that you were going to say. But, along those lines, I would say kind of three points is, a lot of government agencies still have very deep legacy systems that it's very difficult to unlock the data from those systems. If you think of, like in our police department, our computer-aided dispatch, that is inherently designed not to be open. So extracting that data becomes very complicated, and if you've ever had an argument with a cop, it doesn't matter how logical you are. So, which leads me to my second point, which is kind of the cultural change. We've seen a lot of government employees retire, the whole baby boomer effect kind of taking place over the 0 to 5 years, and new data enthusiasts are hitting the organization, and we're seeing this melting pot of, I will refer to them as long-tenured government employees who, if it ain't broke, why are we trying to change it or fix it? Meeting up with, I'll say, younger employees who are very enthusiastic about using data to make data-driven decisions. And so I think there's a cultural change there. Along the dog fooding, it's interesting. Two of our data analytics folks, Kevin, raise your hand. Raise your hand because you signed me up for this panel. Raise your hand. We're working on this project around crash data, and interestingly enough, our police department collects it, and our Department of Transportation reports on it. So we have this whole discussion about who's going to house the data, who's going to provide access to it, whereas the neutral ground really is our open data platform. So we're serving the public's needs. We're also providing a repository that is low maintenance, and also letting internal city departments then consume that for their own reporting purposes. So along the lines, the relaunch, our biggest issues is there's been so much churn in the organization. The IT department is actually not the owner of a lot of these systems. The business owner is who we think of, the people who make those legal decisions as to whether it's private or public, and their army of attorneys. So the cultural shift, the technology, but also the this mashup of talent that's coming into the organization that then wants to consume that in new ways are both the challenge and the opportunity around open data. So
I would love to hear your experiences on how some of the cities that you've worked with have overcome these challenges.
Well, I work with one city, so that city is still getting over those challenges. We seem to have regular conversations about this, and I think our pivot in the relaunch is really driving open data as an opportunity and a new way of doing business internally, as opposed to just being one more thing to do that we're putting out on the website so that we can have 100,000 Public Records Act requests or FOIA requests for those of you who are outside of California about that data. Instead, there's a kind of beyond the open data, or spreadsheets in the sky is my favorite term, because that really doesn't drive public value. And so if we look at how we curate that data, how we make data-driven decisions based on that, but just in full transparent view of the public, so they can look at our raw data, take our formula, and come to the same conclusion, and in some cases not to the same conclusion that we may have in our decision-making process. The public, the elected officials, and the administration that runs the city is all operating from that same set of data, and I think that's important. In terms of challenges, just kind of getting the inertia to get those first few wins is an important, sustainable part of that process.
So I've only been working with more than one institution for probably the last 4 months. And in New York City, I think we had a really, really good launchpad for that sustainability question, for that challenge, which is there was a law. City council actually put together a law and passed it, and the mayor signed it, and there we were. We had to execute on that, which also broke down a lot of doors in the budget department and things like that. It was really easy to go in and have conversations and say, well, by the way, now there's a local law. We need, X amount of dollars for this program. That really helped. So at Center for Government Excellence, we also work with the Sunlight Foundation, and Sunlight Foundation does a lot of work in the policy space. And so between either an ordinance or an executive order, the notion of creating sustainability through something that is very difficult to revoke is what we aim for. It doesn't, an executive order can always be pulled back after, a mayor leaves office and a new mayor comes in, which is why I think we lean more towards the legislation side of things. But at least then you start to have at least a top level framework where you can kind of build in that sustainability from the top and let it weed its way down into the organization. But I think, the way you answer the question, Vijay, is much more makes a lot more sense from a cultural perspective. I mean, it's great that you have sort of a rule that says you have to do it, but you also have to kind of like create the change within the organization, create the demand, and create the supply inside the organization to make it really valuable for people.
So the one thing I'll add, I think y'all have great perspectives on that, is you have to start with education, and a lot of times it's internally. So trying to identify what you can do with data, what other people are doing with data, how it's more than just putting a raw CSV file online and expecting the hackers, as some cities call them, to go and make some magical thing with it. But what's the real business value, and really educating that to all employees, not just the techies, but all employees. Why are we doing this? Why is it important? What are we trying to accomplish? Then I think the second point is setting up goals for what you want to do with data. So what are you trying to accomplish? Is it civic engagement? Are you trying to boost economic development? There's very specific goals that we all have for what we want to accomplish with that data, and I think making those very transparent to the community is also increasingly important. And we also need data for our data so that we have the ability to actually track. Are we actually accomplishing what we've set out to do? Are people using it? I saw a really interesting stat the other day that the World Bank, I love the World Bank, they like PDFs. I don't like PDFs, but only a third of their PDFs have ever been opened once. And so I think that we have some challenges when it comes to reporting on our own data and how we actually make it incredibly useful for people, and that we actually have goals tied to what we're trying to accomplish with it.
That's actually a perfect segue into my next question. And you talk about making sure that the data is useful and it's something that people want. And so I want to ask about data quality. Why is it important? Is it just enough to just throw up a bunch of data sets online?
So this is, you're kind of hitting the core of part of our relaunch of the Open Data website. It is easy to just throw something up there, check the box, and kind of move on. And I think open data for a long time has gotten kind of a bad rap because it started as a transparency. We need to see what the government's up to. Certainly, that's an important part of it, but that's not the only part of it. And I think the applicability and usability of that data in decision making and educating the public is an important part. And some of the data quality that we would get out of some of these legacy systems, we'd have a lookup code that actually existed in the application layer that was XYZ. That means nothing to the public. And so we'd have this column in our spreadsheet in the sky that would say, district XYZ. Okay, that's not really helpful. And one of the most interesting data sets, for some reason, the call center, utilities, all kinds of things are in my department from a customer service perspective. And we decided to put up our schedules for when your trash and recycling gets picked up, what day of the week that your streets are swept. In some parts of San Jose and narrow roads, if you don't move your vehicle off the street, we ticket you. In other parts, the street sweeper goes around you, and then my department gets a call about why there's all these leaves and dirt underneath all of our vehicles. So we decided to put it up. It was completely useless. I mean, it had lookup codes that were in the application layer. So kind of going through there and creating a regular process to make that data refreshed frequently, making it meaningful, ensuring that, it's really just in plain English, easily accessible to the public is an important part of that. And that is one of our challenges and part of the reason for the relaunch, is to get more meaningful, high-quality data out there to the public. So, on the third Thursday of every month, my neighborhood gets swept. I should move my car or get a ticket. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think data tells a story. It's designed to tell a story. And so if you imagine a story and taking out 2 chapters from it, you may miss the entire buildup of the plot. And so I think government data is the same way. A lot of times we haven't focused on the accuracy, especially at the local levels, of the data itself. And so it's like having missing pieces of a book. And we have to complete that story because now our citizens are demanding, they're being shaped by their experiences with private sector companies, and they're expecting the same thing with government agencies. And they're demanding the ability to see data and consume data, not in an Excel spreadsheet, because no one's excited about that, but they're demanding to see it in new ways. And they want to be able to Google things on the city's website and get it, immediately and have it make sense. And so I think that I see accuracy as kind of the next evolution as we start to focus on how we tell the story and making sure it's a complete story that we're telling.
The only thing that I have to that is really a synopsis, and it's you can't make decisions based upon evidence if the evidence you have is not trustworthy. I mean, simple as that, right? So all of this data that we're collecting, that we're gathering, that we've been inheriting in systems for, 20, 30 years in government, I mean, if it's not reliable, then a leader cannot make good decisions about it. And so for me, that's really the most important factor for quality, and that's why quality has to be really has to be high. And if it's not high, you at least have to know kind of the problem areas in it, and be able to sort of weed those out and understand what those challenges are and why they're weak in those areas.
How would you define high quality data? What are the hallmarks of high quality data? What does that even mean?
So I looked this up on Wikipedia. True story. And there's 6 adjectives, maybe 7. So completeness, validity, accuracy, consistency, availability, and timeliness. And one which I liked even more than that, which was how well does the information how well does that data apply to the need for which it's being used? And I think, honestly, sometimes Wikipedia is a terrible place for information, but actually this is a pretty good and succinct point of view that I quite like a lot.
Yeah, I'd probably add easy to understand. I mean, it kind of hits it. Who knew Wikipedia was going to be a great source on this one? But, it's got to be easy to understand. And oftentimes, and I always use the benchmark of if I didn't work for government, I probably wouldn't know where City Hall is because I just don't interact with it every single day. And oftentimes, our interactions with the public on any given Tuesday, which is when our council meetings are, is either they're very passionate about keeping a program or a service that we're doing, or we've done something to disrupt that and we've angered them. And the reality is there's a tremendous amount of work that happens every single day in cities to enrich the lives of its residents, visitors, and businesses that largely goes unseen, but is valuable if it was taken away. And so educating the public about that, being able to understand their feedback and using it as an engagement tool is a great way to kind of highlight what is going on in your city, at your house, your street, your neighborhood, your block, and then for the elected officials, their districts and citywide. But that begins with easy to understand data, and whether it's the elected or the public, that's important.
Yep, that means pretty charts. Yeah. So, so I would the one thing I'd add on there is it has to be contextual as well. So it has to be put into the context of the situation it's being accessed. So, for instance, if I look at my city's financial data, that's great. I can see historically that my city has raised taxes year over year. But is that really helpful to me as a constituent? Well, no, because I want to know how that compares to cities of similar size. And so I think that as we start to think about the evolution of high quality data, we need to think beyond our own boundaries and start to look at how context actually spans all jurisdictions, and being able to use that information in a relevant setting to make data useful to people and to make it something easy to understand. When you look at TurboTax and you're filing your taxes, if it tells you everything you need to know about where you're at, and if you owe money, it's very simple. So I think we have to look at the same experience in government.
We actually have a question from one of our audience members.
I guess you guys are in government, but to what extent do you think it's important to have like an outside advocate that? Because one of the problems I see is governments can release 90% of data, but maybe the missing 10% is what people really want to see. But who's there, demanding that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important. I don't actually work in government now. I just always say we because I still feel like I'm a bureaucrat to a certain extent. But I think that it's incredibly important to have outside support to go and both educate agencies on, the needs to release that type of data. A lot of times I don't know where to start. So it's like, what are you getting the most FOIA requests for? That's where you start, right? But I think, it helps to have someone like that that's really a champion in the community saying, this is what's important to me. This is what we need. And I think back to kind of my initial point about having goals, I think they can't be driven just by the agencies themselves. They can't say, here are our goals for you using my data. It has to be, what does a community actually really need? And there may be, points of strain where you have to figure out ways to unlock that data. And I think that's a really powerful process. And I mean, innovation itself in government is not a simple process. It's very shaky. It's very rocky. Someone's going to be pissed off at you, and that's a sign you're making progress.
And if it goes wrong, usually the CIO gets fired.
That's right. But that's why I'm not in government.
But I mean, to that point, it's interesting because certainly we've talked about some of the challenges, and it's a journey to get there, and it's the journey, not the destination, to use every cliche I can think of. But I think in California specifically, the California Public Records Act is pretty clear. So I think in some of the areas when I look at open data policies and benchmark other cities and things like that, there is those things that from the balance test perspective, the public probably shouldn't know the social security numbers of every single city employee, those types of things. There's some pretty clear ones, and but there are subsets of those data that may be very relevant. And I think of crime occurring, a sexual assault, and the exact location where that sexual assault happened, right? Okay, now we're starting to get into some gray areas, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't take a step back and take a different level of precision for that data. Maybe it's not the exact house, maybe it's the zip code, maybe it's a different level of precision. So I don't think the data is so black and white, and in California it's pretty clear. If you can every single day Public Record Act request a government agency, that's probably going to move up on the on the open data list. So I think it's by default open first, and then figure out what criteria you need to peel back on for the things that don't pass the balance test on the California Public Records Act request.
So I'm a recovering civil servant as well, and I'm still going through some therapy and some issues, but it's fine. I'll get there. It's okay. I had a very different experience with this because I had the fortune of working in New York City, where there is just a massive community of people who really create a massive demand for data. I mean, there's such a booming tech industry there. I mean, I would imagine it's very similar to you guys in San Jose. There's such a booming tech industry that there's so many people who are trying to come up with innovative ways to solve problems, not just for government issues, but for for normal business. And they will often suddenly tap into, what if I had this information from the government, then I could make my product 10 times better. So very vocal community, very active in speaking their needs, so much so that we couldn't meet the demand. We've had to, from my current job at Center for Government Excellence, we've had to kind of rethink that a little bit, just because there isn't that, in some of the smaller cities that we work in, there isn't that massive demand. There isn't a big tech sector. So it's much more about looking for the business partners or the nonprofit folks and saying, okay, well, you obviously already have a working relationship with your government institutions. You're partnering on various things. You might even be contracting to do work for the government. What data benefits from that, or how do you benefit from data in that conversation, right? So how do you produce measurable results for government and the things that you're contracted for, and how does the government give you valuable information that you can use to make decisions to provide better services? And so I think there's a really interesting model, eventually that's going to come about around that stuff that we'll be able to probably share in another, 6 months or a year or something like that, once we've gotten some maturity around it.
Another question?
Hi, John Thompson with Douglas County, Colorado. Question for you is about who owns data quality and the engagements that you guys have been with. One of the things that we're finding is the notion of, well, I'll just give you a spreadsheet and walk away. But obviously there's a story to be told, but who actually is taking ownership in the entities that you're looking at?
That's an interesting question. Who owns data quality in San Jose?
If you were to ask me, the department owner that owns the business system. So if it's our financial management system, it's the finance department. If it's our budget department, it's the budget. Because ultimately, it's their numbers. They make heads or tails of it. You never want to leave it to an IT guy to do that kind of stuff, right? So now, if you were to ask them, they'd probably tell you we're going to leave that to the IT guy. But I think in getting there, part of it is, we're hiring an open data architect to focus on kind of the ramp up, because you got to have some wins, because it just seems like extra work. But the moment you can start getting that to be used by the elected officials and it becomes the new normal, then that's really where that pivot starts to happen. But ultimately, it's always the person. If you put it out in PDF, you also own the results, for the spreadsheet in the sky that they think that they're going to walk away from. Ultimately, who's going to have to answer the question about the data? It's not going to be me. I mean, I don't balance my checkbook, so I'm not answering any questions about a budget for a $2.8 billion organization that's accurate, at least. I'll answer them. But so, I think if you work backwards from the request from the public, who's ultimately the owner of that, and who's going to have to answer the question? That should be the person who's making sure that there's high quality data going out. They've got the most vested interest in not receiving questions about data quality. So,
and riffing off of that a little bit, I think that one of the interesting side effects of making data open is that you get to increase the quality conversation around it, right? So, as soon as you start to think about, well, that's potentially my dirty laundry that's going out on the line into the street, people will make an effort internally to at least try and organize the data a little bit better. We also, in often cases, will recommend to cities don't expect it to be 100% perfect. If you're going to put some data out there, it doesn't have to be completely perfect. You can actually use the opportunity of releasing your open data as a way to improve quality through public engagement. And I think there's probably a whole other set of thoughts around that we can go into. But, the person who owns the data is the person who is closest to it and maintains it, in my view. And I think that's probably a very fuzzy description, but the open data part, I think, really helps drive a little bit of the quality conversation forwards in a way that it hasn't done in other places so far that I've seen.
Yeah, I would say, just to add on to that, it's interesting because that's one of the issues that we're talking about in San Jose now. We always think of innovation coming from the inside out, meaning we're going to perfect it internally and then we're going to put it out there for public consumption. And along the financial discussion of open data around our finances, we looked at a very simple question: where do we spend money? All right, look, it was after a little P card audit, and there were some things that were done that weren't supposed to be done. But it started with this broader conversation about just where do we spend money? It's a very simple question. Where the government spends my money, where does it go? And so we started running down that process, and we're still having these dialogue questions about, well, if we pay by check, it's in this report in our financial system. If it's a wire transfer, somebody fills out this PDF form. It's not form fillable, so you have to print it out and handwrite it. But the point is, if you put it out there, and we know these areas at least we can make incremental progress. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think anyone thinks government gets it right 100% of the time on the first try, right? I mean, there's a high degree that that's probably not going to happen. I like to refer to that as incremental innovation. Look at the Valley. There's always a 1.0, a minimum viable product that gets out there. It's the same thing with open data. You can put that out there, understand what people are asking for, and work backwards in the way we streamline those business processes. Because if you've got to streamline them from the inside out, it lands on somebody's desk that doesn't see a sense of urgency. And I think after you look at kind of the whole economic meltdown, everyone's got 36 hats to wear, and unless there's a sense of urgency, nothing's going to get done. And so I think outside-in innovation is really the approach to kind of getting that incremental 1.0 and having it get better and better and better. And, I think you just be honest with the public. We're starting, and, it's not going to be perfect, and it's going to get better over time.
Yep, I agree. And I mean, I take the public's view to this. When the public is looking for a data set, ultimately it's the government. They don't care who in the government is responsible. They'll just say it's the government. But I would say the one gray area that you have in the public sector is third parties. So if you license data from a third party, especially if you're a state agency and it's not your data, then there's challenges associated with maintaining high quality data. So that's one gray area that I don't have all the answers to today, but I think it's an important distinction that we need to keep in mind as we start to figure out these data sharing agreements and ensuring that someone is responsible for the integrity of that data from the point of origin.
We have another question. Great, all these questions.
So I'm curious if any of you have worked with a data set that accepted feedback from the public, and if so, how you manage the consistency of that data and integrity of it.
I can give you one example of that. It's not something I've personally worked on, but I'm very close with the person who does. So in New York City, there was a whole conversation about taking building outline data and making it available through OpenStreetMap. And there was a bunch of licensing issues that had to get hacked through and all that. And they were. And so eventually OpenStreetMap started pulling New York City's building outline data and hosting it on their platform. And then user edits started coming in on OpenStreetMap, which was really cool. Like, this is a wonderful way to get sort of public input on data, make some small error corrections, maybe make some big things that the city missed, whatever it is. And the way that ended up working out was that there was a tool that was built that could siphon off the edits to OpenStreetMap, basically a list form. And then that could be fed back into the various departments that were responsible for actually owning that data in the first place. And so there was a little bit of a curation process there. It wasn't automated. It wasn't, sort of like, okay, we'll press this button and now all the city's data will be the same as what was on OpenStreetMaps. I think there is, sort of a re-ingestion and a little bit of a, human processing angle to it. And maybe we'll get to the point where with some machine learning and some, a little bit of human touch on it, we can do that sort of automation. But at least in this particular case, it wasn't there yet. So that's the one example that I know about.
So we're still in the crawl phase of our crawl, walk, run, but I think it's a fascinating concept from the perspective of if you look at a lot of tech companies these days that are just kind of crowdsourcing edits and things like that. I mean, Google's probably the best example of that for this type of stuff. I think there's such a fear in government that something's going to go hideously wrong and there'll be, the Denny's will be in the center of the street and not on the corner or something like that, that there's such fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and we always operate from, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that shifting the mindset really around that, I actually think it's less of a technology problem and more of that, kind of institutional, no, we have this process and, we wait until the finance department issues a business tax license, and then and there's always this assumption that somebody's put the data, the internal employees put the data in properly, but somehow the public doesn't. And so I think that's a mind shift that, it's a little further down the road than probably we're ready to tackle at this point. But, on the arc for sure.
Yeah, I would agree completely with that. I think there's definitely a fear associated with it. And when government does collect feedback, it's always unstructured and it doesn't actually tie into a business process or the data itself. It's kind of like, we'll put you in a queue. It's like, when you email webmaster at whatever the city is, right? It's just a black hole of like, yeah, just send it there. We'll get back to you in like 6 years. So I think it's the same thing where we have to get over the, the fear of the crowd and find structured ways to get them to participate. And sometimes, like even with ways, we have to find new ways to engage people that may not be, let me fill out this like 16 question form on your website. We have to find creative ways to crowdsource intelligence from people. Maybe they're driving and there's an error that's found with the app that they're using at that time within the city. I think there's lots of creative ways around it, but we still have to overcome that kind of base, the crowd is actually wise syndrome.
Yeah, so let's use the example of Wikipedia again, right? So if government ran Wikipedia, stick with me, first of all, it wouldn't be released because they'd be too afraid the F word would be on every single page. Like, we just wouldn't even release a product. Now, look at Wikipedia. Okay, I'm sure the F word's on there somewhere. But the reality is it's kind of community policed, edited, managed, maintained, and those types of examples are kind of where that cultural shift really needs to happen. And, it's one part in institutional, governments are bureaucracies. They are designed that way on purpose. Good, bad, or indifferent, mostly bad. But the point is, I think there's room for that to change and evolve. And, I think there's enough people who are committed to their community. There's always that one bad apple. Guess what? They exist in government too.
And on Wikipedia.
And on Wikipedia. So, government employee on Wikipedia, that's the troublemaker.
Oh.
I have a question about how do you effectively handle public safety data? When I say effectively, the gray about the legalese and what is gray and what in your experience, what kind of data does most community would like to know about public safety, and where do you define which is little or quality or versus quantity?
Do you want to take a stab at it?
Let me take a stab at this, because this is actually one we're working on right now. There's some definite laws that define privacy around some of those events. But that's where my earlier discussion about, I think we can change the level of precision. So, maybe you don't know VJ got bit by a dog at his house, but you know that a dog bite happened roughly in this neighborhood. And because I think the value of that data and a lot of data policies I've read recently are you provide all data raw in its natural form and no filtering whatsoever. And I think in a purist view, that sounds great, but then it inherently has people go, well, for privacy reasons, I can't give you anything in this data set because VJ's name is in it. He got bit by a dog. I'm sure that's not a privacy issue. But I think there's value to subsets of those data that can still paint a picture of what's going on in the community from a public safety perspective. Candidly, in San Jose, we decided to be a leader in pension reform. And we had a lot of officers leave. And you know what? We did pretty well with priority 1 calls, priority 2, like burglaries and auto theft. I mean, we saw crime skyrocket. So that became, on the foremost attention of the public. And that's one of those prime areas where they want to see. And yeah, we can always see things like priority 2 calls, like break-ins going up, but it's important to also see the priority 1 calls for context of where officers are spending their time. Homicides, sexual assaults, break-ins where there is actually somebody still on the property. And so those types of things where giving context to what's going on from a public safety, we're not getting to the fact your car was broken in yesterday because we're too busy dealing with the homicide that's, going on right now. So
how often do you produce those data? Do you have to do it like a monthly, or sort of say, oh, this is sexual assault for this month, and next month and whatnot? How do you produce data? Do you say that daily, interactive, sort of dynamic changing of documents or data, or is it more like PDF?
So we're going through and scrubbing it now, and that process takes a little bit. So we're looking at about weekly, and the reason being is it takes a little bit of scrubbing. And if you think about a crime event,
the thing is the scrubbing. There's a lot of people who would say if you even use public safety and data scrubbing, that in itself raises a flag for most citizens and say that, well, before you produce this data, wait a minute, you just scrub this data? Where do you draw the line? Do you have to tell them that you scrub the data before you post it?
Do we have to?
Do we have to? When you have a data out there and you say you scrubbed it.
Yeah. Well, there's some privacy issues, right? Because it comes because it comes right out of our. So it's still raw transactional data, but if it is, and I'll give you the specific instances. If it's a victim's right to privacy issue,
Right.
and if it's an active crime scene, so which is why we don't do it daily, frankly, because at midnight something at 11:59 could still be an active event,
Right.
and so we actually just delay it we just batch it weekly, and then look for those specific codes that are things like victim's right to privacy. It's the only scrubbing that's really going. Otherwise, you can see the literal transactions, and it comes out of our CAD system. So.
Yeah, and I think this is where we have an incredible opportunity within the public sector to build standards for the data so we don't have to have scrubbing, that we can actually have these fields mapped uniform and consistent across jurisdictions, so that way you're just putting out the fields that don't contain PII, and you have an incredible opportunity to streamline that process for individuals and build in those intelligent, kind of conditional algorithms that will, filter out things that may be in place. So I would say, when it comes down to the gray area of like what you can release and everything else, I mean, you go city by city, every city attorney has a different opinion. You go state by state, every AG has their own perspective about it. Some haven't been challenged yet. Like, there's so many different views on what's acceptable. There's some laws in place, sometimes there's not. So I think the opportunity is really for us to just build a standard and then use that as a basis to actually solve this problem.
Yeah, and by scrubbing, I don't mean summarizing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Stephanie Singer from Philadelphia. So speaking of standards, you gave a nice list from Wikipedia of data quality standards, but they were all internal standards in the sense that you have one data set, you look at it in isolation, and you can judge these qualities. Clearly, it's valuable to have data that fits in, a data set that fits into some widely accepted standard. Clearly, it's valuable to have a data set whose URL and formats are consistent over time. Clearly, it's valuable to have a data set that is interoperable with related data sets. So a city has one list of addresses used in every data set. Are there other contextual qualities like that? Contextual desirables for data sets that you've come across?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that we're looking at is beyond government data. In order to make our data relevant to the public, what other complementary data sets are? So we're not a city county. We don't run any school functions. But it is interesting to look at things like, when are high school kids out of school when we have property crime in a certain area of, San Jose. So we don't own those data sets, and, along those lines about, kind of everything nice, neat in rows and columns. We've run probably the most sophisticated school I've seen in San Jose has a Google Calendar that we can make some API calls against of when they're in and out of school. But a lot of them are PDFs and I'm thinking about the parent. I don't have kids, but I'm thinking about the parents who are like, wait, I have to go find a PDF to figure out, whether my kid's in or out of school and things like that. So back to the earlier morning conversation about how do you provide that, I'm going to paraphrase slightly, a high quality user experience. I mean, while we look at standardizing the data sets and stuff, I think there's also just an opportunity from that school providing a better set of data. And we have lots of those. I mean, we have an arena downtown that we own but don't run. So they have events. So now we're looking at the weather and related data sets that start to shade in a picture of what's going on in the community, even if we don't own all the data sets themselves. And it is very difficult. I mean, you think about working with government by government by government agency and city by city by city. It's also school district by school district by school district. And so those standards are necessary when we start trying to paint a picture of what's going on in the community. There's a real cause and effect to that stuff, right? If we're running a concert that runs 3 hours and we see break-ins at our parking garages that surround that, well, that's a pretty good idea of where we should be spending our police resources, right? But we need to kind of get all that data into a manageable format that complement each other.
I just want to sort of go tangential to that and say that I think also metadata is a really interesting part of that conversation, right? Making sure that you have sufficient documentation about the information that you're providing, making sure that in that metadata you're also including potential quality issues in the real data, making note of those, understanding where they are and so on. And I think particularly in the open data movement, metadata is becoming much more of a conversation. I mean, so, the expectation is that a small city that's just getting started in open data probably isn't going to do much in the metadata space. But as you become more mature, more robust, you put out more data, it needs to be more discoverable. Metadata becomes a much more important part of the conversation. And so it actually becomes its own set of quality in that process as well.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add on to that is the presentation layer, which is often left out of the standards themselves. I would consider to be one of the most important aspects, because as people move from city to city and go from place to place, they're used to experiencing and interacting with data in uniform ways. And so if one city reports on it with a certain, like we have government accounting standards that they put out and they like to change every year for, as you know, it just confuses people. And so I think, all the way down to the presentation layer, we have to look at standardizing that so that people have a common way to interface with government.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if any of your organizations consider communications records as part of open data. I mean, I know most public records laws say emails, even text messages, social media are, but I was just wondering if any of your organizations had addressed that or added systems in place to make those types of records public.
We routinely make emails records public. In fact, there was a recent hearing at one of our committees about making the assistant police chief's emails records available. So we routinely do it. I think the thing our attorneys go with, it isn't the email itself that is the record, it is the content of the email that defines its record. So when we have records retention policies and things like that, and in one case, if I'm sending an appraisal of Kevin, for example, who's sitting right behind you, that would have a 2-year policy. If it happened to be financial data, it would be a 7-year policy. So it just depends. And it's also, is it a draft? Is it a convenience copy? Is it the official record? All those types of things come into play. But yeah, I mean, we routinely open up email for public records.
What would you say the quality of that data is?
Well, not being the author, I mean, I would say it is what it is.
It's a smiley face.
And are those, I mean, is that in response to a request, or is there like a read-only inbox where I can look through, say all of the emails?
So we don't have a every email that gets sent ends up on the web somewhere policy. Because, kind of from the human perspective, we do balance those things like attorney-client privilege, our financial status, all those things that end up in the California Public Records Act request as the balance test. And those things where you could end up having a conversation by email with the attorney's office about something that is covered under attorney-client privilege that isn't specifically flagged. And that's where I think we've got a little bit to go on machine learning and kind of those automated routines. So remember, government operates from fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
That's right. Yeah, and I'm seeing agencies go right now with social media where they're actually taking behind the scenes messages and other things that happen on government accounts, and they're building open archives to that. Like Austin's one notable example. You can Google Austin Open Archive. You can search any messages that have been sent from the city or elected officials on Facebook. And so I think that's one step. Email definitely gets into that turf where you have to have some form of authentication to make sure there's no PII in it. So I think that that's not one that we've solved yet, but there is movement to get there because, I mean, when you think about the most requested data that's out there, it's always email correspondence and public safety data and financial data, salaries tied to departments.
We talked about using open data more than just accountability, but more about engaging citizens. How do you not just engage but empower citizens that don't trust governments, that don't have the capacity to actually manipulate the data that you put out there? How do you actually incentivize and empower them to actually go online and use the data that you all put out there?
I would say you solve a problem for them to start. So a lot of times we come up with problems that they have and say, oh, it's because they don't have access to this data. That's why they're, always showing up at council meetings and complaining about things. I think it's starting with what they actually need access to and taking things like budgets suck. There's no one that I know that actually likes budgets, right? So taking something like that someone's going to complain about, they're going to protest their taxes being increased and making it like something that's actually interesting to look at, that makes sense. It's like an infographic. And I think that when you start to present things to them in a way, then they'll engage on it because you solve a problem for them. You make it interesting. You make it something they can consume. And then I think you have to, from a cultural standpoint, get in the trenches with them and really find out what those needs are. And it's not going to be something that they're just going to magically engage with you. I've seen, you can put up an idea platform and people will give you all kinds of stuff, but I think it's really being in the trenches and figuring out, and this varies community by community, what they need to be empowered with, showing them. I think the biggest empowerment you could do is actually being there with them, right next to them and saying, how can we better serve you? What can we give you access to? And I think that we have this complex sometimes of building things and saying, okay, well, this to solve that problem. But I think we have to start with the end user in mind and figure out how can I actually empower this person to be a champion for my agency and to really solve a specific problem that they may have.
Yeah, I would say the presentation layer is also very important to that, and being able to back it up with the raw data. It's funny, we have performance measures, and there's plenty of memos and things that get generated, it seems like every day, week, month, at the city, at every city, not unique to us. And we have this tendency, it's like, okay, well, we've collected a bunch of transactional data, and then we've averaged it for a week, and then 4 weeks equals a month, and we've averaged those 4 weeks, and then a quarterly, and then annually, and it turns out an average of an average of an average is only the average of the last 2 numbers you averaged. So when you go back to the raw data, I think that's part of the reason why we get to this inherent mistrust of government, right? I'd love to see someone try and quote me on that, by the way, an average of an average. So,
someone tweet that.
So it's one of those challenges that I think well-intentioned people who are just putting their nose to the grindstone are just kind of going down this path. And the reality is, if you go back and look at the raw data, and I always think of go to where the authoritative source of information is. If it's our public safety data, it's coming out of our CAD. That is our front door to service delivery for police and fire. You pick up the phone, you dial 911, it begins with the phone call getting picked up and somebody entering something in our CAD system. So where are those knowledge stores in the organization that build trust with the community? That this isn't a report that I then summarized and then handed to you, but I'm literally going to the front door of your service delivery model for public safety, for example.
And there's a notion that open data as a whole is supposed to improve trust in government, and I think there's some. I think there's actually some back into that. I mean, the more granular the information you can release, and the more you can talk about how you arrived at your conclusions based upon that data in a public way, the more trustworthy it becomes. I also think there's a conversation to be had around what I currently call in my head the open data supply chain, which is really where I think governments are just kind of the first layer of that, right? I mean, we're people who put out information, but then there are several layers in between an individual person and that original source, and there's a lot of processing and interpretation and translation that happens in between those layers, and there's probably not a lot of transparency in what happens through those things, because they're often done by private sector organizations or nonprofits who want to make a point or anything like that. So part of our conversation needs to be, how do we empower the open data supply chain to actually do a better job of making sure that things like data provenance are tracked all the way through. So basically, like when you have like a single piece of information, knowing where it came from and how it got to where it is now, I think is super important. It's a very, very early part of the conversation for the open data movement. I mean, it's like we're just starting to think about these things now.
It's interesting that you say that, because you think government's bad at open data? Look at the big vendors that government uses. They're slow, they're monolithic in their implementations. And I'll say up until probably the last 2 years, where all of a sudden you start seeing major vendors start going, okay, I get it. You're going to start voting with your dollar. You're going to start, every elected official's into transparency and performance-driven government. That begins with having access to that data. And the last 3 RFPs we ran, we weighted APIs and data accessibility and things like that as part of the key criteria. That's our HR payroll, our budgeting system. I'm trying to think of the other ones that we've run recently. Our permitting system's currently out on the street, because we want to know where the bottlenecks are in serving the community. Now, that's scary sometimes for government employees who are like, it's going to be my fault. No, maybe that's where we need to invest resources. If you're the only person in this, customer's journey line experience with government, and you're the bottleneck, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing a bad job. Maybe we just need 5 more of you. And so I think it's a different conversation. And historically, data and analytics has been used for things like, well, that's where we're going to cut, and you're the problem, and changing that conversation and beginning with the people at the beginning end of that supply chain, the people who provide those major systems. I love open source stuff, but you ask any CIO whether they're going to open source their payroll system or their HR or their budgeting system for any significant amount. A large city, that's going to be a CIO with a new career shortly. Because you can't wait for a tax table where there's legal implications. So you end up going back to these major vendors. And when we started asking them about APIs, they're like, we'll write some custom code for you. I don't want you to do that. I just want you to give me access to my own data. And that conversation happening through the procurement process, as unwieldy and difficult as government procurement is, that is the one time you get to turn the screws to negotiate and get everything you want while you're in the RFP and contractual phase. That's where you move, open initiatives. That's where you move innovation. When you haven't given them a dime yet, but there's a whole lot of millions of dollars on the line. And they'll commit to anything in a contract at that point.
Yeah.
So to work off of that, I guess this is the perfect next question. Can you talk about, I'm open to all, I think it might be more applicable to media, but talk a little bit about the EA specifically that you have at San Jose, and how does your data actually get out to a data portal? Is there a SQL server? Is there an internal data lake? How do you educate people on actually using those things? Sorry.
No. It's a great question. That's actually why I'm not, dogging your question at all. I think it's a great question. And the biggest challenge out there really is there's kind of three ways to do this, right? There's somebody extracts a CSV file spreadsheet, you throw it on a web server, and it gets ingested by, pick the tool, Junior, Socrata, any one of them, right? The second piece is there's an API that they can tap. And the third is you're going to write your own to front end, like a SQL database or something like that. Each of them have their pros and cons, and candidly, depending on the system, we do all three. That's the reason why it's so difficult to get data to the portal. It's not a desire not to. It's we're hiring the open data architect specifically to do nothing but deal with those issues and work all three of those levels. It's not, candidly, the easiest is to tell people, dump your spreadsheet here and it'll automatically get ingested. It's not sophisticated. There's a lot of tools out there. There's some open source web services. CodeIgniter puts one out. From data transformation, ETL, Altova. There's lots of tools out there, FME. But the challenge with that is it's just another tool to learn, maintain, and suddenly that person's the bottleneck.
So I'm assuming that your city is siloed. I'm from Houston. I run the open data program. Houston is ridiculously siloed, right? So one of the big issues that we have is analysts spend their time reaching out to other departments to say, can I get this data? So do you have some sort of central database? We call it a data lake, which is this concept that we've been trying to get IT to buy onto for so long, which is just some central SQL database or a Tableau server on top of a database that just has access to all the data. So if I'm in parks, I can pull up a health department data set that says, how many people went to go get a flu shot or, something like that. And are those people coming to my park as well? Whatever, something to correlate, I guess, data.
Wow, what's up, big brother? They did too in Minority Report. I'm going to say yes and no. We're getting there because we do now. Bad budgets makes for great partners with IT. That's probably the best way to put it. We've seen lots of departments suddenly want to host things on our enterprise databases. I think IT departments need to be, and I'll include myself and my department in this, more responsive to departments' needs. It's kind of just got to work like a cloud service, right? Click, okay. If it begins with, I need $50,000. I need to hire an employee, I need to train them, and 3 years from now, we'll host your database. It's never going to happen. And so from that perspective, it's even a mind shift with my own database administrators. No, this is going to live in the cloud. You're just going to be managing the data, not replacing hard drives and moving them up the service delivery stack. Most of our major large systems, it's the shadow systems. And I'll give you a recent example. We did a public-private partnership, and McAfee came in and they were going to help us look at our parks department and look at revenues and expenses in real time. And that was the parks department's goal for our community-based programs. And went to the first meeting and I said, trust me, this isn't a technology problem. And it turns out that once a month, somebody's entering the critical data into a spreadsheet, and so their level of precision is only once a month. Well, if you only enter the data in once a month, you're only going to get it once a month. But that's an opportunity. I mean, it's a challenge and an opportunity, because once we kind of crack these big systems, like from the TMZ gossip perspective, our credit cards and how much government employees get paid is super interesting. But the real value of that data is how many people. We invested some money in a parks program for seniors. How many people attended? And then how do they feel about that program? Because if lots of people attended and they all hated it, well, we should probably do something different with that money. And so it's those kind of outcome-based decisions based on data that we're kind of sewing together these different data sets that starts to drive real value. And those are all in these little spreadsheets and FileMaker Pros. You'd be shocked how many FileMaker Pros are out there. So it's those types of things, and they're in all departments that, that's where the real value, I think, of the data comes from.
We're actually about to be kicked out of this room. Our session is scheduled to be over soon. So are there any final thoughts from the panelists?
So an average of an average of an average is no longer the average. It is only the average of the last two numbers you averaged. So.
I think that was perfect.
I would just say focus on standards in the presentation layer. It's time to start to pay attention to those things. It's very important for us to start to look at that, partner with vendors. I think we need a consortium. When you think about how we build USB standards, we have IEEE that comes together. You build a standard for hardware. It's time for that to happen within this movement.
Don't let poor data quality be a reason not to release data to the public.
Thank you again for joining us. We're